Hey, Deserving listeners, this is Chapter 15 in our Duggar Deep Dive. Chapter 14 and Chapter 15 are a follow-up to the first 13 chapters in which we go over your emails and your comments. Not all of them, but a selection of them that actually furthered my understanding and also are helpful for us to talk about. I think it furthers the knowledge and the learning and the understanding and the empathy and the things that we need to know about. It's not just people saying, great job, Kirk, thumbs up, or you suck, or whatever people say. So let's read these emails and these comments and comment on them. Berto, what do you say?
Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast, which it says right there. And everyone, my name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I am a therapist, and I'm also a professor. Berto, who are you?
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I blow the lids off of glass jars.
So, middle tier patron and YouTube member, Mari from Arizona, they say, I'm listening to your deep dive on the Duggars right now. Thank you so much for sharing your frustration about the failures of the system in this case. It makes me feel validated regarding something similar in my life. For those of us who are in situations where we know that children we know are being abused and the system is failing them in the same way, can you talk about things we can do to support these kids and how we can take care of ourselves in these situations? Dr. Kirk, would you be willing to share anything about how you handled your experience with disillusionment with the system? Well, first, Berto, any thoughts?
The bottom line is this feeling of helplessness. Like, I have no say in this. I can only imagine if it was like, but wait, my child or the kid or the thing or the stuff, and you have just like this feeling of helplessness. Wow. It's got to be crazy.
Yeah. So for Mari, what I'll say is that, first off, you're asking, how do we cope with this, or how do I cope with the disillusionment? Well, what I guess, looking back, how I coped with it was I said, well, I have to live with the system as it is, and I decided to do what I could do within the system. And there are a lot of things we can do, and here are some of the things that I did. I found allies within the system. I befriended a lot of people in the Department of Child and Family Services and found that there's a wide variety of folks that work there. There's some people that are very much in alignment with how I think and act, and there are others that aren't. So aligning myself with those people, finding out how the department works and the politics of it. I would also talk with the kids that are being abused. I would validate them. I would confirm that it is abusive, or just even introduce that idea to them. Sometimes I would apologize for how the system harmed them, and I would say that I'm sorry that I guess I'm kind of even a part of it, and you deserve to be apologized to. I would tell them that I would have a number of conversations with teenagers about how they just have to hold out for, if I determined that they were in an impossible situation, like I'm thinking of one kid who was in a family with a mom that I had diagnosed without telling her. I diagnosed in my head that she had narcissistic personality disorder. It was a pretty classic case. And she talked incessantly. She was lacking in empathy. She was determined to blame everyone else for her problems. She had a very fragile ego, but she wasn't physically violent. And so I was talking with one of the kids in individual therapy for a while, and I was trying to work on the mom. I was trying to work with the dad. I was trying to work with the kid. I was trying to work with the siblings. And I was trying to do a lot of things to affect change so that the kid would experience less abuse. And then in the end, I predicted it was going to take a lot longer than the kid had left in the house for me to put a significant dent in the abuse that was happening and the emotional abuse that was happening in the family. And CPS was involved, and they were saying, well, it doesn't really rise beyond the threshold to take the kids out of the home or anything. And so at some point, a year into it, I think I said to the teenage boy, I just said, look, here's how I see it. You're being abused, and that is real. And the best thing I can do for you right now is to tell you that, is to validate that, and to continue to validate that in all of our time that we have left together in therapy. And also, if you want me to try to be an agent of change, you can't tell your mom that I said that to you, because she will pull you out of therapy, or I don't know what she'll do, but it won't go well. And so when I'm interacting with your mom, you have to understand that I am interacting with someone that has a disorder, and I have to accommodate that to some extent just to hold on to her in therapy, but I will be subtly working on her. But
especially if she's narcissistic, there's a lot of things you can't say because it'll trigger.
Yeah. I can't criticize.
Yeah.
I can't say, I can't even raise a question as to like, have you thought maybe there might be some change in parenting?
You're done, out of here.
Like really what it involved, to be honest, and this is true for a lot of people with more severe narcissistic personality, is I just listened to her for hours at a time while she just ranted and raved about everything. And I just validated.
Like a captive audience at a rally or something.
Like a parent hearing from a 5-year-old as they talk irrationally about what happened. You witnessed it. You're like, that's not what happened, kid. But they're in a state. They're very hurt, or their ego is bruised, and they're ranting. And you don't go like to a 5-year-old. You don't say, your perspective is wrong. Like everyone, you listen and you're with them, and they're 5. You get so situation. I'm telling him this, the client, and he's agreeing in a very somber way, like, oh, and this was many conversations that I'm describing here. And I mean, I even remember like where he was sitting in my office, and I'm telling him all this, and I'm also telling him that we have to do what we can to mitigate the risk of you being harmed, or lower the harm from here until you turn 18, because once you're 18 or when you graduate from high school, you have the power to do whatever you want to. What would you do? And he's telling me something like, well, I'd move out. I would, I have a cousin or something. And he, because he was doing well in school, he was a responsible kid, and there was no doubt that he was going to be successful. And so I said, okay, so you just have that amount of time. So we need to do everything we can, because essentially what he was doing was at the age of 16-ish, he was realizing that it was all bullshit, and he was fighting against her. He was saying, no, you can't talk to us like that. You can't talk to me like that. You can't rant and rave all the time. It's not the you show. It's there are other people in this world, and that would cause him a lot of problems, because then she would attack him. And so I was trying to explain to him what I saw in his mom, and I don't know if I used the diagnosis, but I was telling him that there are some people that have certain disorders or certain schemas or behaviors and traumas that lead to them doing this and da-da-da. And he was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And we worked together and collaboratively came to the conclusion that the best course of action, the best plan, is to not fight against her, but to internally validate himself as he's being bulldozed, and to get by as best he could until he can get away. That is rough, because emotional abuse is real. It's not lesser than physical. But with the government, they, generally speaking, in my anecdotal experience, they tend not to react to emotional abuse as much, especially if it's in this category, right?
Right.
So they you have a lot of kids who are stuck, and in my view, they should have CPS react to that. Absolutely. I mean, this situation was completely ridiculous. It was obvious what was happening to these kids. I mean, all you had to do was talk to the mom for 15 minutes, and you're just like, what? I mean, the things she would say about her kids, you're like, even though I don't know your kids, I'm pretty sure that is not true. That, the way she would characterize these people, And so I had to work within the system. Well, what could I do? I don't just give up. I don't throw my hands up and say, well, the system has failed, so fuck it. I guess that's the end of the game. I said, okay.
You have to work within those constraints. Yeah.
Here are the rules. Well, what can I do? And I did that a number of times. I can think of a handful off the top of my head where I was having those conversations with kids.
Quick question for you. What do you call this? Like, not necessarily diagnosis-wise, but like, I mentioned this to you a while ago, but years ago, it was actually during the pandemic. Yeah. I was having this conversation with this gal who I literally just met in that moment. Someone introduced me, like, oh, meet so-and-so. I'm like, okay. And the gal, an older individual, started talking about her daughter and how a daughter or son, I think it was a daughter, and how much of a genius her daughter was, how amazingly accomplished. And I was like, oh, wow, that's okay. And I was, trying to follow along, maybe ask a question. And I could barely even ask any questions. It was just constant. Like, it kept going. I'm like, wow, that's incredible. And I'm validating. I'm like, oh, wow, that is genius. Like, that's incredible. And it's like, oh, yeah. And it keeps going and going. And then I would try to, like, offer, like, a little, because this. And then she would just come right back and keep going. And it never stopped. I basically, she couldn't care less about anything I would have had to say.
Yeah.
Even about the validations about what she's saying.
Right.
What is that? It wasn't about her. It was about her daughter.
I mean, I don't know, but
I know. But it's like,
it is a hallmark of narcissism.
It's so frustrating, though. You're trying to, like, interact with it, but you can't even interact. Like,
yeah. I mean, what is potentially happening, and who knows, but often what I find when I assess folks like this over time is that internally what's happening for them is they equate safety with being the center of attention. And it's not just like they prefer to be the center of attention. They actually feel tremendously unsafe and just untethered potentially to reality when they're not the center of attention, to the point where if their narcissistic supply dries up, they fall off a cliff and they fall into an abyss that they don't know which way is up. It is terrifying to these folks. You'll hear borderline personality disordered individuals talk about how they'll fall into this abyss, but they are more willing to acknowledge it to people because they're more likely to reach out for help. For narcissistic people, they don't want to acknowledge this. They don't want to, and they certainly don't want to ask for help because of their defensive structure. So they have the same abyss, though, and they are terrified. So they're in this constant treadmill of narcissistic supply, and I'm the best. I'm not just like okay, but I'm the best because I have to counteract this massive, it's like you have this scale and there's this giant tanker truck that is like on one side that is saying you're a piece of crap, you're irrelevant, you're nothing. So on the other side of that scale, I can't just be like you're normal, you're average,
you're the best.
You're mostly a good person. You have to be the best. And
there was this moment too where they had said something along the lines of, oh, and they were working, I'm mixing the facts, but it's like, and they were working on this project, and like, they basically like didn't interact with anyone for weeks, and they were and I said something like, oh, that must have been hard. Like, basically, because the way they were describing it sounded like, obviously I'm not getting the facts right, but if you heard it, it sounds like someone being a little unbalanced on the scale of like being too focused or maybe eschewing social relationships with. So I said something like, oh, that must have been hard for them. And they were like so confused by my statement. It's like, oh, no, not at all. Like they just, and just went right into it.
It was their kids that they're talking about.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So that scale for you to suggest, and it's barely in balance at any given time. Right. And so for you to suggest, I'm just going to take a guess based on the way you're describing it, is that the child is suffering in some way, even though...
And in a positive way, like meaning like, oh, that must have been hard for them,
Yeah, not that, you're not saying it's
they're
the
bad
parent,
or something. No.
that it's the parent's fault. You're not saying, why did you put your child into that line of fire? You're just saying, oh, that must have been tough. It's possible, quite possible, that the parent... any implication that they aren't perfect and thus their parenting isn't perfect and thus if their kid is suffering in some way, then the scale doesn't do this, the scale does this. Do you know what I mean? It's all or nothing. And so for these individuals, they will be compelled, not always, there's certain types of people with narcissism, but to show off. And one of the styles that they can do that, and they learn this when they're very young, is if they just talk and talk and talk about things that are impressive. Sometimes they'll talk about themselves. Sometimes they'll talk about their kids. Sometimes they'll talk about things that they did, like, you wouldn't believe this vacation I went on. And they'll just detail like, event after event, and it's all the best. I had the best champagne and the best food, and all these important people were there. And they're not bragging about them. They might even be bragging about these other things that are outside of them, but it's associated with them. Okay. So they're bulldozing. They also have so little tolerance for other people taking up space because that means they're not taking up space. And that's, again, terrifying to them. But anyway, let's take a break, Berto. When we get back, more emails. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right, back from the break. This next email is from an anonymous patron. She writes, when talking about the reasons why a child would sexually abuse a younger child, You mentioned that a surgery when the perpetrator was young could possibly be one contributor that may do that. Can you provide more information and clarify about that? Thank you so much. So I can't imagine that I said that directly, like, kids who have surgeries when they're young become perpetrators when they're older. But I'm guessing that I was referring possibly to the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, and my speculation, and maybe other people speculate this as well, that if I remember correctly, he had several surgeries as a young child because he had some sort of medical condition. I think like dozens of medical procedures from the ages of like 2 to 5 or something. And you could absolutely imagine a child, especially back then when I'm guessing the bedside manner or the emotional care of children going through surgery wasn't exactly the focus, that could lead to a feeling for a child of being abused. And I've had clients who actually would eventually disclose this to me. You have a 4-year-old child that has to have a pretty difficult procedure, and they're strapped up to a bunch of monitors, and they're in a strange place, a hospital. There are all these strangers, the doctors, the nurses. They want to go home. There's difficulty making them comfortable. It's heartbreaking as a parent. And even if you do everything right, even with the best bedside manner and the best parents, it's terrifying. It's terrifying for me as an adult, as a 52-year-old man, when I have to go through things like that. Yeah, it's a thing. And imagine being 4 years old and you don't even understand how the world works, and you don't have ways of soothing yourself, and you're terrified of everything potentially. And not only that, but you know that they're breaking into your body, not only with needles and with IVs, but they're potentially cutting you open. It is, you could imagine a child interpreting this as invasive and maybe even kind of like sexually abusive. There's a lot of hands on you that you don't want. You might even be fighting against it and saying, do not touch me, but it might be a life-saving procedure that you need. And, even if you're going along with it at 4, like you basically know this is a good thing, it can be really traumatic for people. So,
well, like even today, I took my 7-year-old to get a blood draw. And, it was, I could see it be traumatizing. She really didn't want to. And I'm holding her, whispering, we have to do it. I'm so sorry. It's going to be quick. And the lady was so nice, and it was quick, and it was the smallest little, and she was in tears.
So imagine that times 1,000, where it's like a whole 72 hours that happens.
And multiple surgeries.
Like, 40 times. Yeah. You can imagine how traumatic that would be, how horrific that would be for you. So, with Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the speculations that I had, and maybe others have, I don't want to take credit for it if it's out there, but is that could lead to someone coping with that trauma by trying to identify with the abuser or recreate it or get their hands around it. He, at an early age, was dissecting animals, liked to find animals, roadkill, and he was very fascinated with body parts.
He was operating on them,
Yeah, and then later, of course, he took humans and did that as well. So I'm not saying that having surgery trauma, if you will, at a young age leads to those kinds of things, but we could imagine that being a factor for some people, unfortunately. It's one of those situations where it was absolutely necessary to save their lives.
Well, and obviously you're talking about an extreme with so many operations, probably the predisposition, blah, blah. But it's just even in general, like if you don't have a way to talk about it with your kids and stuff, about an operation or taking blood or things, it can be...
Yeah. If Jeffrey Dahmer had a better family life that wasn't constantly conflictual, as reported, I think, by all 3 of those individuals in that house, right? The parents and Jeffrey Dahmer. Or if his parents were more attuned or something, could that damage have been healed and mitigated 99%? Yeah. I'm not saying kids are doomed. I'm just saying that it's a difficult thing to deal with. Listener Charity, she wrote in and said, "Dear Dr. Kirk and Humberto," and then there's a whole section where she talks about how she was raised in a fundamentalist Christian church. She goes on, "From my earliest memories, I was taught that men are completely uncontrollable no matter what their age. Yeah. They don't have the power to control their own sexual urges. So it's our job as women to protect them by dressing a certain way, speaking a certain way, and acting a certain way in order to help them out as much as possible with this defect of theirs. I was made to wear baggy clothes. To remain modest, I was often severely overdressed and immensely uncomfortable. I was made to wear multiple layers in hot summer or loose baggy clothes. Both were methods of shielding my body from the world, or some might say, shielding the world from my body. When I was around 7 years old, I had this shirt, and it had a strawberry on it with the phrase, "Too sweet." It was one of my favorite shirts because it was more girly than the stuff I would usually wear. At this age, I hadn't developed breasts yet, by the way, at 7. My mom and I were about to go out to meet my grandpa for lunch, her dad. She saw I was wearing the strawberry t-shirt, and she told me I needed to go back to my room and change because, quote, "Your grandpa will see that it says too sweet, and he'll be able to see your nipples poking through, and he might stare at them." She goes on to say, the emailer, "It makes me feel sick to my stomach writing this about my 7-year-old self." What do you think?
Oh, it's heartbreaking. So here's the thing, right? Because what happens is that you observe a natural phenomena, which is, teenagers, both boys and girls, but definitely boys, go through hormonal phases. And in those hormonal phases, you're getting boners all the time. You are like, oh God, this is fascinating stuff. And you observe that. I'm talking about thousands of years ago, a million years ago, you observe it, whatever. And you see that it can cause issues, right? Because you might have some uncontrollable behavior. You might act out. You might grab someone and stuff. And your conclusion is, oh, well, that's impossible to address through any other means than we have to criminalize and subjugate the women. Instead of I wonder if we could have conversations starting from early ages about our feelings and about how to control our minds, not only about sexuality. What about violent impulses? What about any number of things?
Right. Yeah.
How come no one's saying, well, boys can't control their violent impulses. So when you're on the field playing football, you can't show any aggression to the boys because they might punch you in the face.
Oh, well, it would be equally as victim shaming. And also, sexualizing a 7-year-old and her nipples, you're trying to avoid the problem, but you're actually creating a problem. She wasn't thinking about her as a sexual being at the age of 7, but now she is. Because,
now she is.
And you're saying Grandpa thinks of her.
I know, and now you're putting these weird dynamics in play.
What are you saying? Grandpa is turned on? We could see, given everything we've heard and read, that the mom was literally just indoctrinated into this notion of just from the day a girl is born, her body is shameful and has to be covered.
So I have a 7-year-old, and you should see the outfit she decided to wear for her first day of class. A faux leather black jacket, a leopard print skirt. I can't imagine in my wildest dreams shaming her or something, right?
Yeah.
Now, would I post her pictures with those kinds of things on public forums where people would sexualize her and stuff? No, of course I wouldn't.
One of the major realizations that I had in doing this deep dive is that the way in which they try to prevent sexualization of any kind, whether it's children or adults outside of procreation, right, has this effect where
it's sexualized.
You're sexualizing everyone because you're constantly talking about it. You're so hypervigilant about it that you're raising this idea, not only for 7-year-olds, but you could, for 16-year-olds, you're telling these boys, you have to, constantly be vigilant about not looking at porn and masturbating, and
exactly.
And the devil is in your soul just trying to get you to have sex or to think about sex. And to a 16-year-old boy, it's well, I wasn't thinking about sex, but I am now.
There's this old sermon from this guy named Oral Roberts. Oral Roberts, that was his name. He was a big preacher, very famous. And there's this sermon where he's talking about how you got to push these feelings away, but the way he's talking about it, it's because these feelings, and it feels good. Oh, I can't tell you how good it feels. That's how he's talking about it. By the way, I think in some of those sermons, he's actually talking also about homosexual impulses. And he's and it might feel really good, but you gotta push those away. I'm All you're doing is making everyone who's listening to you want to go do the best sex things they can.
Yeah.
That's all you're doing right now.
Yeah. Anonymous patron, she writes in, it says, "Hi, I've been a patron since early 2020. Well, thanks, anonymous patron. While listening to the Duggar Deep Dives, I was shocked to hear you talk offhand about someone who, quote unquote, hung herself. You've done deep dives on suicide before, so you should know better than to talk about someone's means of suicide. The best practice is to not talk about someone's suicidal means. Every discussion of suicide means should be done thoughtfully and for a reason. You could have said that she died by suicide instead of saying what you said. I don't see any reason why you needed to say how she died by suicide." Berto?
I hadn't thought of that. I've talked about before how I have had and still have mixed feelings about suicide because I had my uncle when I was little died by suicide. But I never and so I was, you've made me aware of like not saying like they committed or whatever. I hadn't thought about like, not talking about how they did it, I guess. But at the same time, part of me is like, well, wait a minute. At some point, I want to have a discussion about things. And so maybe we could have the debate of like, well, but does discussing the different means of doing it, is that productive or is that actually bad and stuff? I hadn't thought about it. It's an interesting thought.
Yeah, and it is something that, of course, I know. And anonymous patron, I appreciate you raising this. Thinking back, so for those who don't remember, I believe what I was talking about was one of the teenage girls who, since she was a very young child, she was involved in pageants. Yeah. And she was on that reality TV show, Tiaras and something.
Toddlers and Tiaras. Oh.
There's a famous meme of her, and anyway, she grew up and was subsequently in a lot of pageants, and she was good, and she would win a lot. And then she, at the age of, 16 or 17, just north of Seattle, actually, she took her own life. She died by suicide, and it's speculated that it might have been because of the pressure that she was under, and also she had recently lost a very important pageant that she was hoping to win. And so as I'm telling the story, I didn't preamble it with anything. I didn't prepare anybody. And then I just said, she blanked herself. And you were mortified by it. You're just like, oh my God. And other people were writing in saying like, Jesus Christ, Kirk, like give us a warning. That was rough to hear. And I totally understand that. And that was a mistake of mine. In the moment, I was thinking I wanted to narrativize it so it did have not a harmfully shocking value, but a shocking value nonetheless. That was for the purpose of, there are so many children that are being abused in this way. And there are these, because the broader topic we were talking about was exploiting children for reality TV or exploiting children for entertainment on YouTube or even in movies, and that sort of thing. And how children are being, very, very much harmed. And the cases where we have children who die, then we can point to those as examples of an extreme case of a whole spectrum of harms that are happening to kids that aren't dying, right? These are the outliers. They're not common, but they illuminate something that is happening in a different way that's harming children all the time. And this idea of pumping kids full of ideas, can a child be involved in a pageant and have it not be harmful? Sure, but why take the risk? And especially with a reality TV show. And so there's so many other things that you can do with kids. Like you can put on like a harmless little neighborhood pageant where you don't prepare for it for literally all year round. You just prepare for it for the morning, and you put on a sash and you parade around. Like you have to have a gauge of how much pressure am I putting on these kids about winning and beating other kids and looking perfect and being
applying
perfect.
All the makeup and bathing suits and things that do sexualize them.
Right, exactly. So I was trying to organize my notes in a way that actually did have some impact, but I went too far, and I get that. Not only was it triggering to people, but I also did stray from the best practice of not necessarily talking about the method, the means of suicide. But the thing here is that it's not a rule that you never talk about the means. It's just that an anonymous patron put it well, that you don't talk about the means unless it's really relevant, right? And it wasn't really relevant to the story. I didn't have to say the means. I could have just said that she died. It would have been equally as shocking to know that she died by suicide. And the reason why there's this rule is there's a number of things that people will experience when either they have attempted in the past or they have loved ones that have died by suicide, is that whenever people, like, if I have a friend that died by suicide and I told someone and I said, oh yeah, my friend died by suicide, a lot of people will say, oh, how did they die? And you think, well, why do you, what is,
that's just scandalizing and you're spotlighting something I don't want to talk about.
Yeah, you're just morbidly in this moment as I'm telling you about my grief.
Right.
You need to know
the least important thing about what I'm saying right now.
Yeah. I get the curiosity. Honestly, I do. But have some empathy here.
So I totally get that. I have a negative reaction when I am asked, and I realize that it's not always healthy, but when I'm asked to not say something a certain way, to use different words and things like this. And the reason is because I feel that sometimes it's done in a way that assumes that I should already know not to do it. Mm-hmm. This is not what this is not an example of that, but it has happened to me where it's like, how can you say that? You should know that. I'm like, no, I don't actually. I've said that for 30, 40 years, however long I've been alive.
Yeah, I totally get that. I just want to have a little asterisk to say that there are some instances where we should do due diligence to figure stuff like that out before we have to be told. You know what I mean? But there are a lot of times when...
As an example, there was one time where I said... I now forget what the word was, but it was a word about, and then it's got a connotation about ableness, and I was like, oh, I didn't think about that, but you just kind of...
Was it lame?
Yeah, lame. Yeah. Actually, you're like lame, and I didn't ever think about that, and you let me know, and I was like, oh. Okay.
And I would not have shamed you.
But no, of course not, and you didn't do that. But I could imagine someone being like, you can't use that word. Don't you know any better? And I'd be like, no, And part of it is because like I could all of a sudden come out and say like you're like, oh, you're from Colombia, right? And I'd say, why would you say that? I'm like, what do you mean? I'm not from Colombia. Like I'm a human. Like that makes me sound like I'm an other. That makes me sound like I'm less than. And maybe I have a legitimate claim. But if I'm going to introduce a new rule like that, I would do it empathetically. Like, you know what, Kirk? I know it's weird or whatever, but I'm asking you as a favor. Can you not say I'm from Colombia? By the way, this isn't real, but can you not say I'm from Colombia? Can you just say like, whatever, I'm Colombian or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And you can or cannot support me in that.
Well,
but I certainly wouldn't expect that from the get-go you would know for a fact that that's how you need to do it.
Unless it's one of those topics that you probably should have looked into it.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Sometimes there is that case. So another reason why we don't want to talk about the means is because for people that have had deaths like this, or people who think about this or even attempted, it's even triggering to talk about suicide to begin with, let alone to put a vision in someone's head, to put like an actual picture in someone else's head is particularly hurtful and particularly triggering, right? So, we could imagine if I went further down that road of just like, okay, this happened and, let me show you a picture, right? So what's relevant is that to the story that I was telling about this Toddlers and Tiaras cast member was that she died by suicide. We don't know why she died by suicide because she left a note that didn't illuminate anything, but it does raise a question. That's all that's relevant. It doesn't matter the means. Okay, so next email, Seattle area patron she says, I was taken to a Bill Gothard seminar at the age of 15.
Whoa.
And I was swallowed whole. I think,
the belly of the beast.
I think meaning that I was completely indoctrinated into the Bill Gothard universe. My marriage was arranged at the age of 22 to someone I barely knew. The marriage was abusive from the beginning. but I didn't even realize it. Probably because she was in this cult that didn't allow for her to recognize that. A therapist helped me realize that I was being abused after my husband's sudden death. I didn't kill him, FYI. My whole world was shattered at that point when I learned that I was in a cult. And we are all trying to figure out what's real now moving forward. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's one of those movie moments. You know, in the movies, in the Matrix or in Fight Club, when, spoiler alert, you learn that Tyler Durden is really an alien. No, but it's those moments in those movies where you're like, wait, what? Everything I thought I knew up until now, I have to question everything.
Yeah.
I went through moving away from religion, and there were some shock moments for me where I really felt betrayed. And I was so angry. Oh, I remember being so angry at the system and even to some extent my family. Like, as an example, when I was reading the Da Vinci Code, this is how naive I was about some of the stuff. I was reading the Da Vinci Code with my wife, and we were both Catholic. And at that point in our life, she was still, I was a Christian.
You transferred from Catholic to Christian.
I was a Christian.
And she was still Catholic.
Yeah.
Okay.
But either way, we were reading the Da Vinci Code. And we get to a point in the book where they talk about the Council of Nicaea, where this group of dudes decided what the reality of certain chapters of the Bible was going to be and all these things. And I'm thinking this is made up for the book. But she had gone to college, taken history, knew a lot more than me. It's like, no, that was real. This happened. I'm like, what? And I'm like, you and you? I'm like, and it was this moment of anger and realization of like, what? The universe is a lie? Like some dudes in a room decided with, you know, like the tumble, like the ceiling came crashing down on me.
Yeah.
And that is not anything compared to like being raised in a full-on cult and all these things, and then realizing that, but I can relate to in those ways, you know?
Yeah. Where is my mind, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine, if you haven't gone through something like this, where every fiber of your being, all the assumptions that you make are potentially wrong, right? Because for these folks that emerge out of these cults, whatever the cult may be, or out of a gaslit, high control relationship, they initially, hopefully, know that maybe some of the major things are false. But you don't necessarily know all the things that were false that you were indoctrinated into. And there's so many things that don't have checks and balances in the world, like just as an outside experience that we might be able to relate to is whether you wipe sitting or standing. You know, like for a long time for myself, and I've heard this from other people, that they just thought that the way they did it was the way everyone did it, because of course, how else could you do it? And then at a certain point you learn, oh no, there's this whole other camp of people that do it the other way. And you're thinking, so I've been doing it like there's an option, you know what I mean? I didn't even think that was possible. And when you were growing up until the time maybe you're 30 years old, you're just like, this is the way the universe works. Of course you stand up. That's just, I mean, how could you possibly do it when you're sitting down? Yeah. Like the physics don't even work at that point. And then all of a sudden you find out, no, there is another way. And maybe you even find out that you do it in a minority group, right? And then you think, well, my God, what else am I doing? Like, there's so many things we do by ourselves, and there's so many thoughts we have up to ourselves, so many assumptions we have. We don't talk about all the assumptions that we make, right? We don't talk about all the perceptions we have. We don't go, by the way, right now I'm seeing an airplane. Is that what you're seeing?
Right.
By the way, I just saw 2 cars crash.
I'm seeing a salmon. I mean an orange. I mean a pink shirt.
I just saw 2 cars crash. We all agree that's a bad thing, right? Like that's destruction of property. Okay. Like, we don't do that. There's so much that we just absorb.
We take for granted,
Through observation as children, we watch everyone around us. So we're like, oh, cars crashing is bad. Oh, that's an airplane. Oh, of course, we stand up because freaks sit down. Okay. So we just have these like absorbs. We just absorbs.
We have absorbs.
Yeah. And and so once you're out of the cult and you start to disentangle your brainwashing, it calls everything into question, and you're left wondering, I don't have enough years of life to ask,
right?
What am I right about? And what am I wrong about?
Adorbs. Our little baby brains absorbs.
I know, that's what I thought. I was like, there's adorbs? Anyway.
So as a kid, growing up in Colombia at my house, the main bathroom had the toilet and a bidet. But as a kid, I didn't know what the bidet was. All I knew is I sat on the toilet, and there was always this thing in front of me that had a little water spout that could go like this. And what I would use it for is to wash my feet.
But why were you washing your feet? Were your feet dirty particularly? Or?
No, I just assumed that that's what it was for.
So every time you went to the bathroom, you also
No. When I went to the bathroom, like when I would take a shower, sometimes, not always.
You take a shower, and then you'd...
Sometimes, not always, would wash my feet in the bidet. You know why? Because you were just saying, as a child...
You brainwashed yourself.
I assumed this thing has little water. It's not for my face. Mm-hmm. It must be for my feet.
Yeah, well, so in that moment, you might have wondered, what else in the bathroom times am I not aware of?
I've given another example where I used to hear, when my dad was showering, I would sometimes hear these patting noises.
Oh, no.
Patting noises. And what I thought was happening, when you shower, you have to like pat with the soap. And that when you were done showering, to get as much water off before you use your towel, you had to get the water off your body to make the towel less wet.
Okay.
I did that for years. When I would shower,
okay,
I would pat myself with the soap. And when I was done showering, I would spend like 5 minutes wiping water off my body and then use the towel.
And then there's a ceremonial grunt at the end that you... Wait, is that what you're talking about?
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But well, I mean, I'm assuming. I never asked.
Yeah.
But I never thought of that. Of course, why would I?
Yeah.
I was a kid.
One last story that's similar to this. So I would watch commercials, as everyone did in the 70s, of cologne. And back then, the cologne commercials, they would have these guys in these fancy bathrooms, and slow motion, they would be taking the aftershave or the cologne and splashing it.
I remember this.
Right? They'd be just splashing
Yes.
it because they had just figured out how to use slow motion in commercials. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, but...
And that's what they teach you to do.
So my dad had some cologne, a big bottle of something that he was done with or he didn't want, and for some reason it ended up in my hands. And I'm like, I'm in the second grade or something. And because I'm like,
of course,
well, okay, I guess I should try to be a man or something. And I don't know anyone else in school that wore cologne, but this was cologne day for me. So in the morning before school,
in slow motion.
So I put like, just a full pool of the cologne in my face and splashed it into my face. And I was, and it just,
Did you get in your eyes?
It just goes everywhere, and I'm thinking, all right, well, off to school. So, imagine having everything that you learned from 0 to 20. And also, it's not just like cologne and bidets. It's your fundamental understanding of who you are and your place in the universe and how physics works, regarding God and heaven and hell, and how morality works, how sexuality works, how your body, everything has been invaded upon in your mind, and then you emerge out, and it takes a long time to disentangle, and it's very disconcerting. You feel very untethered, and it's very upsetting. So anonymous patron wrote in and said, in the early 2000s, when I was a young mom, I asked some leaders in my church for some resources. They pointed me towards Michael Pearl. Do you remember Michael Pearl?
Yeah.
He wrote this famous book that is promoting corporal punishment. It's famous because a lot of these evangelicals or IBLP people would be prescribing this book as this Bible of parenting because it was, promoting religious ideas along with very harsh.
Sorry, it has a lot of that same language as the 8 is enough gal.
Right. Eight passengers.
Eight passengers. Eight is enough.
Ruby, Frankie, and Jody
What is
Hildebrand.
Eight is enough?
That's a TV show from the 70s that I loved. And you're too young for it. I was barely old enough.
So what's called Eight Passengers?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But anyways, a lot of that same language of corporal punishment and like nothing is too much. And
right. So when we were doing this deep dive, one of the realizations was like there's this whole cult that is promoting child abuse, and it's right under our noses. And then that was disconcerting because it's not just a cult in Waco, Texas of like 50 people. It's this whole swath of the central states. It's all over the country, maybe all over the world. Then we hear about Ruby Frankie and Jody Hildebrand. That story comes out while we're doing the deep dive, while we're recording and publishing this deep dive on the Duggars, which blossoms into a whole other thing that I look into. And then I start learning about all these, because not only does it play into this, it's not Michael Pearl specifically, but it's this fundamentalist Christian movement to abuse children and to make parenting great again, you know, also to indoctrinate children into whatever cult that they're in, whether it's IBLP or some other religious cult. But it also involves the exploitation of children on YouTube, which was right up. It was just so interesting that in the middle of us ranting and raving about these things, this humongous case just like emerges. Anyway,
by the way, my 7-year-old is such a character.
Yeah,
and I film her all the time, and she does the most outrageous, hilarious things. And she's like, "Ooh, I want to start a channel," and I had to have this like conversation with her about why we can film and send it to our families and relatives, but how it's probably not a good idea for us to start a channel. But
how did you justify it?
Well, she was confused because she sees channels with
kids.
I think what I said basically like, I think I said some variant of what happens is that when you put this on actual YouTube, anyone can see it, and you don't get to control who sees it or what they think of us or you. And I think I gave an example, like imagine it, you know, I was like, because, you know, when she does perform at school or whatever, I said, do you wonder what, you know, people might have thought about your performance? They're like, yeah. And, you know, do you maybe get sometimes self-conscious? Like, yeah. And I said, well, imagine if everyone in the world has an opinion and you can't control any of it. And I don't know if it worked, but it was like, that was kind of the analogy.
Yeah, it's great because that is at least one of the non-harmful ideas. Because if you talked about her being sexualized.
Oh, right. Well, you don't want to tempt grandpa with your.
Right.
It's like,
and so, yeah.
And by the way, it's not even like I certainly wouldn't post any YouTube videos with her being like sexualized her. But even just like just the fact that she is a child doing funny things, as much as it tempts me to like, oh, let's get the world to see this. We've talked about it. I've seen. I know. Yeah. So I said, I know why. Like ultimately, if I do it, it'd be for my own narcissistic needs, not for her.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and maybe for her. I mean, she's asking for it. But it's the parents' responsibility to protect children from their impulses, right?
Well, and I have impulses sometimes of like, that is so funny. My child is so interesting and interactive. Right. I want to show this to the world. Yeah. And I have to fight those impulses and be like, why?
Yeah. Anonymous patron, she writes in the early 2000s, when I was a young mom, I asked some leaders in my church for some resources. They pointed me towards Michael Pearl and his book and his teaching. I read the book and immediately asked for a meeting with the leaders in the church because I was worried about what's in the book. The book says so what this anonymous patron is pointing out to us is we had highlighted some of the problems with this book, but she is saying it's worse than what you thought. And let me give you some details.
Oh, jeez.
The book says to punish children with a rod, children as young as 5 months old, Berto. So we went over this notion about this teaching by Michael Pearl. And it's not just Michael Pearl and his teaching. It's that a lot of people are rallying around this book, right? And holding it, ministers and whole organizations, IBLP, Bill Gothard, are saying this is the way. And so not only using a rod on children, but as young as 5 months old, Berto. Can you imagine?
Before they're even verbal, the world is this dangerous place that is going to, at any moment, kill them.
So if you're going to indoctrinate children, into maybe not necessarily a cult, but if you're going to indoctrinate children into the idea they have no power and that they must obey, and that is the primary goal of parenting, as we have been learning often is present in this way of thinking, that is prevalent in a disturbingly high percentage of Americans and maybe around the world, right? You need to start early. So can you imagine what kind of sick, disgusting monster of a parent would strike a 5-month-old child? It's monstrous at any age, but 5 months old, Berto. Like that, I'm not a proponent of the death penalty, but when I hear stuff like this, it's just like, you don't deserve to enjoy the fruits of life. So
I have memories of when my firstborn was little, and we started discussing how to discipline. We had read, we had thought, and so here's what our plan was. Okay, here's what we're gonna do. And we're talking about maybe she's 2 or something. We're thinking, okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a little timeout. So what we set up, and by the way, later with our second one, we did time-ins. Actually, even when the first one was older, we did time-ins where one of the parents was still with them. But at first, we didn't know that part. But we would basically do this thing where we had this little gate. It was the little child gate, the safety gate. And when she would do something like she was, really throwing the food and refusing whatever, okay, it's time for a timeout. We're very sorry. So we would go put her there, put the little gate, and then be like, all right. So when you're ready to talk, because she's like screaming, it's like, when you're ready to talk, you let me know. So when she calmed down a little bit, it was like, okay, now we're going to have a little conversation. Like I said, later on, we learned that maybe timeout still feels like, so we started doing time-ins, which is like same thing, but one of us basically sits right next to the whole time. We might not be talking, we might just be waiting for them to come out, but we're there the whole time. And even that, when I was leaving her there in her little thing, and I'm like, that was so hard for me.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, oh, the poor little thing. But you still have to do something, because if you don't, then they really don't learn boundaries and things. I cannot imagine.
Yeah. So, going on, Berto, it gets worse. That passage you mentioned about a child eating oats. So I read this passage about how you can, the child won't eat the oats, and then the child turns to mom and says, "Mom, I don't want to eat the oats."
Oh,
and
yes.
then the prescription is mom comes over and beats the child to make the child not triangulate, not to reach out to the other parents. That passage you mentioned, and in my head, I thought, and I might have even portrayed it this way, that it, maybe it's like a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old or something.
Right.
That passage you mentioned about a child eating oats is about a very young baby just learning to eat solid foods. So in the book, according to an honest patron, they are explicit. That story about the oats is
the baby
is a toddler. It's horrendous. However you take it, but that's interesting because that is part of the indoctrination, right? You can't let them enjoy their early childhood without indoctrinating them into the idea that they don't matter and that they must obey without question and that they don't exist in the world, These are
like old rules for dogs.
Yeah.
That you wouldn't even do now to a dog.
Right.
Being applied to human babies.
Yeah. 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 Then there's blanket training, where you lure your baby off the blanket and then punish them.
I know.
Have you heard of this?
Well, we talked about it, and they talked about it in...
Microphone.
Sorry. Well, we talked about it, and they talked about it in the documentary. But, so I had a little blankie when I was a little kid. It was a blanket that my grandma put together, and she embroidered these beautiful little teddies and stuff. And it was my security blanket. The thought of that being taken from me as a punishment and withheld and all that stuff.
No, I don't think that's that. I mean, that's awful.
Oh, no. Right. I remember the other thing they talked about. Oh, yes. This is also horrible.
Well, what do you remember? Because I have a vague memory of, what do you remember?
Yeah, they talked about it in one of those documentaries. Oh. It was basically the, you take the child and you... is something where you like isolate them with
a I think what it is they take the child, and don't quote me on this, but from early, pre-verbal, they are on their blanket, and you tell them not to move, and then you tempt them with something else, and if they move, then you punish them physically to get them to follow your directions.
They can't move off the blanket.
I think so. Don't quote me on that, but I know that is part of what's in this book. There are things like that where they will tempt infants, pre-verbal infants, with temptation while the parent is saying, do not do this. And then when they do it, they will strike the child.
That makes sense, or just horribly, that makes sense. But I thought there was another aspect to the whole blanket piece, which was...
You might be right.
But anyways, either way, it's like...
Yeah, going on.
Horrific.
It says to only breastfeed every 4 hours and only for like 20 minutes, if I recall correctly. Unless you're naturally gifted, that's nowhere near enough to keep milk production up. The Pearls state, Michael Pearl and his wife, state that you shouldn't give a bottle. You should just trust your body is enough. Even back then, I was able to find a few cases of failure to thrive, meaning death of a child, due to the Pearl's recommendation of breastfeeding practices, which of course makes sense. And plus, why? What is the purpose? Do you not want your child to have nourishment? What is it? Just this general hatred of children and infants? I mean, it kind of looks like that, right? Because it's one thing to try to make children obey. Like, I guess I get their twisted logic there, but what would be the purpose in saying you can't give children a bottle and you should only feed them every 4 hours for 20 minutes? Like,
the bottle, I quote, get as in that they're saying it's got to be all from the breast. This is very important, the bottle thing. But I think the other part might be about teaching that they are not in control, that they have to be subject to absolute
right, exactly. Because infants will cry out, or older children will even reach out and say, "Hey, I would like," and so this is teaching the child that it's on a regimen and they have to follow a schedule.
And look, us progressive modern parents do struggle. I know we have. With overindulgence, over coddling and stuff. It's true. But oh my God, the extremes. Why the extremes?
Yeah. Well, I don't know what do you mean by over coddling?
Yeah, like basically like, especially with our first child. And me, I was definitely guilty of this. Like, oh no, they scraped their knee. Oh, did you fall? And then the child actually gets anxious about that. Like, oh. With my second child, I was a lot more like, they fell, it's okay, Yeah. But or just things like with my first, I always had this dream in my mind that everything was going to be perfect. I was going to homeschool my child. They were going to.
You were?
Oh yeah. I was going to be independently wealthy so I could homeschool, and I was going to turn them into these perfect geniuses. And they were going to be trained in all the martial arts and all the music and all the math and other things. Reality crashed into my head and my face and everything. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's not going to work. Throw away about 90% of that. But still, with this 10%, I'm going to make sure everything's perfect.
Yeah.
Going to buy everything organic. Nothing non-organic is going to touch their skin. Everything's going to be flawless.
Yeah, you're concerned, and you see how fragile they are when they're young. And you also know that there's damage that can happen and damage that will happen. So you're doing everything. And then imagine that you prescribe, and then you have people that are prescribing this, the leaders of the church, and there's all these parents that are following it, where it's just like, yeah, throw that all out the window. You're creating an obedient automaton. Right. And the way to that is to deprive and to beat your 5-month-old child. Yeah. I just can't imagine what would motivate anyone to even think about even putting a 5-month-old in timeout. Like that, if someone put a 5-month-old in timeout, they're a monster to me too.
It's like, what does that even mean?
Like, right?
What does that even mean?
Well, so extend that to beating a what do you think you're teaching a 5-month-old? What behavior does a 5-month-old child do that you're thinking, yeah, you deserve to be disciplined? Like, what could you possibly have in your head?
You're part of this bigger mission, which is not about how cute this baby is. It's that you are trying to create these kinds of creatures with a certain mentality that, again, is part of this meta reality that you need to fulfill, not what you see, not the little cute little creature defenseless that you see. It's about this other thing.
Yeah. And when I think about cults or, super religious fundamentalist people, I usually think about what I've seen, the things that I see in the news or the more salacious things, the leader is having sex with all the wives or something like that. What is forgotten or ignored or not talked about or is invisible is this. If it's 50 people in Waco, Texas, like, terrible. But if you're talking about millions of people that are still around doing this, Michael Pearl's book is still selling on Amazon today. It is still a very successful book. There are parents out there doing this right now. The Duggar documentary and our deep dive has not eliminated this practice. It's still strong. It could be even stronger now than it was before. In fact, statistics show, as we talked about in another deep dive, that fundamentalism is on the rise.
Yeah, and there's a renaissance of like, we're turning our kids into wusses, feminizing them. Gotta toughen up.
Yeah. So going on with the email. So after reading the book, I was concerned. I told the leaders I had a lot of concerns for child abuse and neglect within this book. They explained to me that I just didn't have enough life experience to understand the truth. The meeting was like 2 hours because I was really trying to convince them, but I was dismissed for being in my early 20s, and I just wasn't godly enough to understand.
Right.
I often wonder about that congregation and how the kids fared. Maybe I should have done more, but I did what I could. I brought it to their attention with scientific studies to back up my claims, and then I raised my own kids with as much love and grace as I could. So, yeah, I don't think you could ask yourself to have done anything more. You did a lot more than what a lot of other people would have done.
Yeah.
And what were you going to do? Change their minds? I mean, that does not seem like a likelihood. So, yeah, you absolutely did what you could. All right, let's take a break, Berto. And when we get back, it will just be for patrons of the podcast. And we are going to finish this chapter. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
And if you're not a patron, we're going to say goodbye. And until next time, take care of yourself because
you deserve it.